Solve by completing the square y squared minus 3y equals 4. Again, I'm going to rewrite this, leaving some room to complete the square on the left-hand side. Now, to complete the square here, we need to take the coefficient of y and divide it by 2. Negative 3 divided by 2 is negative 3 halves. And then we have to square that. Well, a negative times a negative is a positive, so the result will be positive. 3 squared equals 9, and then 2 squared equals 4. So when we take that coefficient, divide it by 2, and square it, we end up with 9/4. So we're going to add 9/4 to both sides. Now that we've completed the square, we can factor the trinomial on the left-hand side. We end up with y minus 3 halves squared. Remember that when we have a perfect square trinomial, to find the second term, we take whatever we got after we divided the coefficient by 2. So negative 3 divided by 2 is negative 3 halves. So this is going to become y minus 3 halves squared. On the right-hand side, we're going to have to add 4 plus 9/4. 4 is the same as 4 over 1. So we have 4 over 1 plus 9/4. We're going to need to have a common denominator. In this case, that'll be 4. 4 over 1 becomes 16/4. So we have 16/4 plus 9/4, which gives us 25/4. So on the right-hand side, we end up with 25/4. Now we can apply the square root property and take the square root of both sides. On the left, the square root of y minus 3 halves squared is just y minus 3 halves, because taking the square root undoes the squaring. On the right, we've got plus or minus, and the square root of 25/4 is 5 halves. So we end up with plus or minus 5 halves on the right-hand side. Now, to get y alone, we have to add 3 halves to both sides. When we do that, we're left with y on the left-hand side, and on the right-hand side, we have 3 halves plus or minus 5 halves. Now, we know that this corresponds to two solutions. One of them is 3 halves plus 5 halves, and the other is 3 halves minus 5 halves. We're going to want to write these out separately. 3 halves plus 5 halves, or 3 halves minus 5 halves. And the reason we want to write them out separately is because when we do that, we're now in a position where we can combine like terms and simplify our answer. 3 halves plus 5 halves is 8 halves. But 8 divided by 2 is 4. So our first solution is y equals 4. For the second solution, 3 halves minus 5 halves is negative 2 halves. And negative 2 divided by 2 is negative 1. So we end up with our final answer, y equals 4, or y equals negative 1.